Hello and welcome to another Doctor Who Big Finish review. In today's Doctor Who Big Finish review, I'll be reviewing the 7th Doctor New Adventures box set what came out last week, featuring the 7th Doctor and Chris and Roz, which have only appeared in the novel adaptations, and a part of me feels like Gary Russell isn't going to be buying this box set.
Chris and Roz, oh god, I hated Chris and Roz. The worst characters ever in the entire history of any genre book ever.
Sorry, Gary. So, yes, for a while I've been wanting Chris and Roz to appear outside the novel adaptation, because obviously the novel adaptations have come to an abrupt finish last year. Big Finish said they're not doing any more. But that's a topic for a different video, for me talking about why the novel adaptations failed, because I've got my own theories why they didn't work out in the end. And I sort of thought, you know, wouldn't it be great to have Chris and Roz in the main range, because the main range can become quite stagnant quite easily. And I feel like each year the main range needs to have a different TARDIS team with a different Doctor, you know. So one year you have the 5th Doctor with the season 19 TARDIS group, and next year you have just Nyssa. When it comes to the 7th Doctor, I've been pretty vocal in the fact that I'm not a fan of the Ace and Mel trilogy stuff. It's just something what just doesn't work in my opinion. So I was thinking, wouldn't it be nice to have Chris and Roz in the main range, just to add a bit more spark and interest in there? And I kind of got my answer in the form of this box set, with having 4 one-hour-long stories, with this being part of Big Finish's 20th anniversary celebration. So without further ado, let's look at the presentation. So taking a look at the presentation for this box set, we have the 7th Doctor there in his Virgin New Adventures outfit, then we have Roz, then we have Chris. And what I quite like is this cover kind of teases at some of the adventures the Doctor and his crew are going to go on. So we have some sort of robots from episode 2, then we have the ship from episode 3, then we have the TARDIS being imprisoned, then we have some sort of drawings there from episode 4. Another thing what I really like about this cover art is that it is a very nice homage to the 7th Doctor intro, with the whole sort of purple orb there in the middle. And what I quite like is how it sort of blends in the sort of red crystals from the logo reveal with the sort of Sylvester McCoy sort of meteorite. So it's a very nice blend of the two. The side of the release and the back of the box. If you want to know more about the 4 stories, then you can. Removing the slipcase, you're greeted by the same cover there, and also we have an image of the cover on the back with the details of the 4 stories, who wrote them, and the running time being 5 hours. The side of the release. Taking a look at the leaflet, we have the cast credits there and a photo of some of the cast involved in this release. Then we have sort of the details of what's on each disc. Then we have production credits there. And then we have the reversible cover there for the booklet if you want to change it, which I have to say, it looks really nice. Moving on to the discs now, so there's disc 1, the Trial of a Time Machine. Then we have disc 2, Vanguard, and then we have the reversible cover if you want to change the logo. Disc 3, the Jabari Countdown. Disc 4, the Dread of Night. And disc 5 is Behind the Scenes. So kicking off with the first story, Trial of a Time Lord. Sorry, I mean Time Machine. So was this a great opener for the box set? Answer: yes, it's a very good opener. I will say that this is my most anticipated story from the set, since Andy Lane wrote one of my favourite 7th Doctor audios, which is 1,000 Tiny Wings. And he certainly did deliver in this. Now when you read the synopsis, you think, oh, this sounds like a really fun story with the TARDIS being put on trial. So you kind of think that this is the story in the same realms as the Sky Pirates, you know, looks absolutely wacky. However, this story may have a fun exterior, but the story itself is rather rich. It's full of depth, with 2 of the strongest things about the story being exploring the Doctor and the TARDIS's symbiotic relationship, making us have some really touching scenes between the Doctor and the TARDIS, and the society Andy Lane creates within this story, with it being rather interesting, with it having a very interesting approach to time travel, with time travel only working one way, with the story really exploring the law system of this planet, with it being judged by the impact of the crime, what it has on society, you know, whether it has any outcomes or benefits. So it's quite an interesting idea. But the story is rather intriguing, you know, who is the Magistrum, you know, what is the purpose of these flying insects? And it's one of those stories where you have to concentrate fully to pick up on the subtle details what the story has to offer. And I feel like this is a great story to reintroduce Chris and Roz, as they are adjudicators. So this is where they get to do some of their own investigations while the Doctor's busy defending the TARDIS in court. We have Chris and Roz doing some investigation, so it's quite nice for them to go back to their roots and sort of reintroduce us to those characters what we might not have heard or read for a while. So this story really does work in Chris and Roz's favour, with it really sort of examining lore. So moving on to the negatives. Now this story does suffer the same problem what I had with Return to the Web Planet, in the form of you know, you wonder how this story is going to wrap up in 15 minutes, and it's still introducing plot points to be explored and, you know, fully realised and developed. So, you know, those plot points what are introduced very late on within the story do come across, you know, half developed, and the story does end rather abruptly in my opinion. But saying that, the story does come, you know, rather full circle. Moving on to characters now, the Doctor played by Sylvester McCoy. Now McCoy is absolutely on fine form within this, with him getting some really beautiful scenes between him and the TARDIS, and it just feels like McCoy has a different kind of energy, whether they're because this box set is something new and different for him to explore, or a different side of his Doctor to explore and, you know, characterise, I don't know, but it just seems like McCoy throughout this entire box has a different energy to what you experience in other Sylvester McCoy releases. We do have the classic 7th Doctor with him rolling his R's, which is very good. One thing what I really do like about Sylvester McCoy within this story is he's just really bemused by this planet, you know, seeing how he can bring down the law system. It's quite interesting to see the Doctor really put in a tight situation with him trying to figure out how can he free the TARDIS. So I think it's a really interesting idea. Roz, played by Yasmin Bannerman. An excellent performance by Yasmin Bannerman, with her being very much assertive, you know, full of authority and, you know, wanting to solve the crime. So her adjudicator skills are used rather effectively throughout. And I will say this, I'm only going to be talking about the Doctor, Chris and Roz within this story because I'll be very much echoing the same, you know, points throughout the other 3 stories. You know, if there are other things what I want to mention about these characters, I'll mention them in the actual story bit itself, and I'll talk about some new characters within that section itself. But moving on to Chris, played by Travis Oliver. You know, he's very much the comic relief within this story, with him very much learning and is very much under Roz's wing, and, you know, very much just come into his own in the latter half of the story and acts as sort of an audience member. He's kind of, you know, Roz is very much of a Doctor character, and Chris is very much the companion. So what are my concluding thoughts on Trial of a Time Machine? Well, I think that it's a very strong start with some intriguing ideas, especially around the society Andy Lane has created, with some excellent sound design to capture the scale of the story. You know, a story what looks rather fun, with some nice funny moments scattered throughout, but the story has so much more to offer than being a light-hearted romp. With this story being rather rich in the form of world building and exploring the history of this planet, with this story having a very bold start with the TARDIS flying through the vortex, it's a story what starts off with a bang, and that's why I'm going to give this story an 8.5 out of 10. I just really enjoyed it, just because of the scenes of the Doctor and the TARDIS. Was just utterly beautiful. You know, McCoy just sells those moments, and just the world Andy Lane created. Just a very interesting society, and it's just a great way to reintroduce Chris and Roz to people who may not have experienced those characters before, or have had a bit of time away not reading the books or listening to the adaptation. So it's a great way to reintroduce those characters, in my opinion. So this is a strong start for the box set. The second story, Vanguard. You might get a bit of deja vu with this one, because I get a bit of Exotron vibes from it, with these robot titans which are wonderfully realised within this story, with them having their own personality and not suffering falls or malfunctions. So what do I think of Vanguard? Well, I think it's a pretty good story. I will say the first half is probably the strongest. Then after that, the story really starts to dwindle, as it has an interesting concept at its heart, but it does feel like a story you've heard before. But more on that later. Now, the start of the story is very fast moving, with it having this bold, epic movie start. You know, why is this character called Green wanting to send for help, you know, while the others are against her? So the Doctor and crew arrive on a planet what has become desolate from a war, and this story really just put the Doctor and his crew through a ringer, from landslides to the deadly takers, which are pretty horrific, you know, causing some, you know, body horror moments throughout the story. I will say it's interesting having the Doctor and Chris and Roz split up, so they're working with different fractions, showing how each character would solve a certain situation. But so once all that is introduced, the story does slow right down and becomes, you know, full of exposition, which in my opinion does hinder the story slightly. Also, the story does become rather wacky and very sort of fantasy-esque. I think that's the only way I can kind of describe it. So if you've listened to the story, you'll sort of know where I'm getting, because it does take a bit of a bizarre turn in the second act, which I'm not really too much of a fan of. It kind of loses me. This is when the story starts to drift away from me, in my opinion. The story really does suffer with minor pacing issues, but I do like the city of Vanguard, with it being scattered and full of danger. But I do like the theme what the story has, you know, with the story sort of exploring how war affects small people. Moving on to characters now, with Green, played by Olivia Morris, a very caring, you know, a character what thinking of her world's future, and is just concerned, you know, very concerned and troubled, you know, that she wants to make things right, she wants help. So yeah, a very interesting character who gets developed very nicely throughout the story and has some great interactions with the Doctor. Blue, played by Connor Corland, you know, a typical military character, you know, fairly aggressive, you know, trying to think of the bigger picture and survival. And it's an interesting reason why there is animosity between him and Green. So, Contessa, played by Sarah Powell. What a nasty, creepy piece of work. So yeah, she does an excellent performance, you know, being sort of the main villain of this story. You know, she's very sly and manipulative, and just the perfect villain to go up against the Seventh Doctor. Overall, what do I think of Vanguard? Well, overall I think that it has some great ideas at its heart, but it just lands as a story you've heard before, with the world building being very interesting, with it looking at both sides of the Dauntless and the Intrepid. A story what starts off so well but just slowly loses me as it goes on, with the ending being rather predictable, and again it suffers from the abrupt ending. If this story lost some of its exposition, it could really flesh out some of the ideas it sort of introduces in the latter half of the story. You know, I feel like this story itself does remind me very much of Series 11. I can see Jodie Whittaker and her gang exploring this war-torn planet. It does feel like very much a Series 11 style story. I will give credit for the story trying to be experimental with the whole wacky idea in the middle, even though it didn't land with me. You know, I feel like it does seem very much a Virgin New Adventure thing in a way, in that sense. So I do appreciate that, how it was trying to sort of be a homage to that in a way. And I probably think that out of the 4 stories, this is probably the most Virgin New Adventures style story, because it does have some sort of gruesome moments in the form of the Takers. Now, it may sound that I've been pretty negative towards this story, but I still appreciate with what it's trying to do. I think that's the main thing, that I still enjoy it. I really did enjoy the first half of this story because it was just really strong and fast moving. It's just a shame that it kind of got bogged down in exposition. It's a story that has its moments, but it just is sort of lost in the sort of pacing issues, really. So I'm going to give this story either a 6 or a 7, but I'm going to be generous and I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10, because I do appreciate with what the story's trying to offer, but I can see that this story can come across as a story you've probably heard before. The Jabari Countdown. Well, this is one interesting story which I really don't want to say too much on, because this story is full of twists and revelations. So what do I think of this one? Well, I think that it's an absolutely brilliant story. What is so jam-packed, full of stuff. You really do wonder, how is this story going to achieve everything it wants to do in 1 hour? And you know what? It does it perfectly. Everything is wrapped up nicely, and even has time to add a little bow to the little package. So it is a wonderful release. The start of the story, it does seem like a rather fun adventure with the Doctor pretending to be a pirate, and we do have some nice little funny moments at the start. But also at the start we have a rather unsettling moment. Now, the story is essentially one big mystery with a few horror moments scattered throughout, from isolation to looming fog and something stalking this abandoned house, and, you know, power flickering on and off. And the story becomes very claustrophobic in the middle, with it introducing a timer. But going back to the mystery, you know, why has the TARDIS been brought off course by an alien signal, and why has a group of mathematicians been brought to solve this mystery of this house? And the mystery of the house is rather interesting, and a very interesting twist. You know, what are the Jabari, and, you know, how are they spreading this infection, which I will say is a really clever idea of how they spread this infection. But quickly talking about the characters, I don't really want to talk about these characters individually because they're all part of this mystery, but I will say they're all well fleshed out. They all have a sort of dark secret, you know, hidden past, which will slowly be revealed throughout the story. So their characters, I don't really want to talk about too much. You know, you've got this doddery old woman called Alpha, to this lieutenant character. It's just, you know, a wide variety of supporting characters what really do sort of add that sense of mystery. You know, why have these characters all been brought together to solve this sort of puzzle within this house, really? I will say that this story is great for Chris, as he gets some lovely sweet interactions with a character called Eleanor. I feel like this story is very much made for Chris. This is probably his strongest outing within the box set. So what are my overall thoughts on the Jabari Countdown? Well, I think this is a brilliant addition to the set, with this story really fitting into the setting of World War II, with the story constantly keeping you guessing and reveals itself bit by bit. At times the story can come across rather unsettling, with some really clever ideas and brilliant supporting characters. It's a story you just need to experience. It's one of those stories I don't want to say too much on, and I'm going to be quite vague about the next story as well, because these 2 stories I feel like you just need to experience for yourself to get the full enjoyment, because, oh, they're definitely some interesting stories. So I'm going to give the Jabari Countdown a 9.5 out of 10. It's just a really enjoyable story, you know, this really fun but quite unsettling story and claustrophobic at times. It's just a story that has a lot going for it, and I just really love the whole mystery surrounding this house. It's just a wonderful story and just a brilliant addition to this box set. Moving on to the final story, The Dread of Night. Well, this is definitely the spooky gothic horror story of the set. However, it does seem very similar to the previous story in the set in terms of the basic plot, and it does remind me of Night Thoughts in a way. Not the podcast me and JR can reviews do, but the Big Finish audio. So this story itself is very much a horror story, and it has a clear direction where this story wants to go, which I think is brilliant. So what do I think of The Dread of Night? It is another brilliant story, a creepy and gripping gothic house story, with a couple of moments that made me jump, and I'm just going to warn you, the main jump scare within this release is around the 40-minute mark, so you have been warned. Because there are a few little jump scares throughout this story, which is what you want from a horror story, isn't it? Sylvester McCoy is at his best as the Doctor, with him being full of mystery and him working things out in the background, with him saying to Chris and Roz, you know, you handle the people and I'll handle everything else. So this is proper Seventh Doctor, with us getting some real powerful speeches, and you definitely feel like the Seventh Doctor knows more than what he's telling. So it's a bit like Ghost-like in a way. The atmosphere for this story is absolutely superb, with it being very foreboding and very ominous, with the sound design utilising a sort of music box to which really does help build that creepy, unsettling atmosphere in this troubled house. The story really explores Roz very well in terms of her family. Again, I don't want to speak too much about the characters because, again, it will spoil the whole fun and mystery of this story. But I will say that this story does create some strong imagery, from the creepy nursery to the basement. This story uses classic horror tropes to its advantage, with them really getting their money out of the lightning sound effect and the distant rumble of thunder. So what are my concluding thoughts on The Dread of Night? Well, overall, I think that this is a very strong outing, and it is a perfect way to close off a Seventh Doctor box set, with this story having some very interesting twists and some very dark and haunting twists, and some twists you don't really see coming. It is just a story full of surprises, jump scares, and it is just a classic horror story. It's a story what I can see people are going to be talking about for a long time. I feel like this is probably the standout story within the box set. You know, I'm sorry if I've been very vague about the last two stories. Again, I just want you to experience them for yourself. I know horror is very subjective, so you might find it not as scary as other people, because again, horror is very much a subjective thing. But I think that it is a brilliant, you know, classic Seventh Doctor story. You know, this is, when you think of a Seventh Doctor story, this is how a Seventh Doctor story is. You know, this is the basis for Seventh Doctor being all mysterious and knowing more than what he's letting on, and this really does let Sylvester McCoy shine and really test, you know, show that dark, broody Doctor, which, you know, I think that's when the Seventh Doctor works at his best, when he's dark and broody and not being this clown and comedic, because this story really does let Sylvester McCoy shine. And again, I feel like this story is very much for Roz. You know, the last story was very much for Chris, but this is very much for Roz, where we see Roz get a fair bit to do within it. So I think that this is a brilliant way to conclude this box set. So I'm going to give this story a 10 out of 10. I just think that it is a really strong way to close the box set, and it's just one story what you have to experience, because it is a perfect Seventh Doctor story in my eyes. So what are my concluding thoughts on the Seventh Doctor New Adventures box set? Well, I think that it does exactly what it says on the tin. It brings you 4 stories featuring the Seventh Doctor, Chris and Roz, and I feel like each story brings something different to the table, in the form of Trial of a Time Machine being very much having this fun exterior, but has a lot more going for it. It's a very rich story, in my opinion, and the second story is very much your sci-fi romp of the story, because the first 2 stories are very much your sci-fi thrillers and romps of the story, and then the sort of second half of the box set is where you get your gothic horror stories. It's kind of mixed between the two, and I definitely do prefer the second half of the box set, which is not saying that the first half is bad. I just feel like the first half suffers from introducing ideas too late and just not having enough time to wrap it up. I feel like those stories possibly need an extra 5 or 10 minutes just to make it feel a bit more solid and make them fully realise those ideas what they're just trying to develop. I feel like the second half is the strongest, because I feel like the stories are a lot more interesting, in my opinion. I just feel like they've got a little bit more going for them, you know, the whole mystery around these characters, and just the whole environment, what the writers create, especially the Jabari countdown. I think that that's a real standout of this release in a way, just because of the sheer scale of this story and how much it achieves within an hour. It's wonderful. and then you have a very nice traditional ghost story in the form of the Dread of Night. So I feel like this box set kind of covers all areas of the Seventh Doctor in a way. But as in terms of style of the new adventures, like I said, I feel like Vanguard is probably your most closest story to a Virgin New Adventure, but I do feel like this box set is very much Big Finish's own take on the Virgin New Adventures. It's so in a way it's not traditional Virgin New Adventures in a sense, because it's not that dark nitty-gritty storytelling in that sense. Maybe when we get a few box sets down the line we'll start to get down more to the Virgin New Adventures territory, but like I said, this is very much you know, Big Finish's own take on that. And I do feel like this box set, if you haven't experienced Chris and Roz before, then you'll be absolutely fine, because I feel like Trial of a Time Machine reintroduces them rather well, because obviously they're adjudicators, and that sort of story is all about law and can be quite political at times. So it's a great way to introduce these characters what come from a sort of law-enforced background in a way. So it's a great way to reintroduce those. So I think that it's a perfect way for people who haven't experienced those characters before to jump on. Because there are, you know, they're 4 1-hour-long stories, so you know they're perfect for new listeners in a way. But I feel like for long-term Virgin New Adventures fans, I feel like you'll get a kick. You'll probably get more of a kick than I did, because you probably got the history and knowledge of what happens to these characters and everything, what goes on. Because I'm not that big on the Virgin New Adventures. So if you are a fan of the Virgin New Adventures, you'll probably get a lot of kick. You'll probably notice little references what I haven't noticed within this box set. You know, we do have a little reference to the Reapers in Trial of a Time Machine, which is quite nice to that story in Father's Day. But yeah, I feel like if you are a fan of the Seventh Doctor, then you're going to want to get this, and it is definitely a box set I do recommend. So I'm going to give this box set an overall rating of 8.5 out of 10. A very solid box set with some very interesting ideas. And like I said, each story does bring something different to the table and does offer something different for a Seventh Doctor fan, really. So yes, a very interesting box set. So yeah, there we go. That's my review of the Seventh Doctor New Adventures Volume 1. I hope you have enjoyed it. And I'll see you on my next video, which will be a review of the Fourth Doctor Adventures Series 3. So thank you very much, and goodbye.